Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution. And we have a very special guest here tonight, George Will, a great defender of the Constitution. And I want all of you to recite the mandate of the National Constitution Center to inspire George in his educational labors. The National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Beautiful. You see what a wonderful job our congregation does in this church and temple of the Constitution. And tonight we are gathered to discuss one of the most urgent, if perhaps not the most noticed, issues in American constitutional debate, and that is the future of federalism, and in particular, does the 17th Amendment represent the death of federalism? I had the extraordinary honor of being at the Union League in February, I think it was 2017, and I heard Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, 2 weeks before his death, declare the 17th Amendment represented the end of federalism. And we are here to unpack that statement. We have the leading authorities in America on both sides of this urgent debate, and then we're going to culminate in a conversation that I've been looking forward to so much with George Will about what Madison would think of our current American democracy and the future of federalism and the future of the Constitution. All of this is possible because of the generosity of a great patriot and friend of the Constitution, John Aguilar. And John has sponsored a series of superb conversations about structural constitutional issues, including whether we should have a term limits amendment, the future of gerrymandering, and now he is especially interested in this question of the future of the 17th Amendment. And I'm so delighted to ask you to welcome and thank John Aguilar.
Good evening. As Jeff said, I've been privileged to have sponsored two previous programs here at the Constitution Center. The first program was on the virtue of congressional term limits, and the second on the evils of gerrymandering. You may have been here. And prospects to kill gerrymandering. We don't view it as closely as we should. It's both parties are guilty of it, and it does affect elections. And politicians go in now as new congressmen or congresswomen, and they're thinking about their pension, and that's the virtue of term limits. But my purpose has been to sponsor programs where collaboration, common ground, might exist between the left and the right and their philosophic divide, such as today. Hoping to reach prospective political solutions through debate. It's only through debate do opposites, having respect for each other, listen, and perhaps we can get things done. Tonight the program is the 17th Amendment, to repeal or not to repeal. The 17th Amendment gathered steam and ultimate passage during the Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson years. It was a good time for progressivism in general. In 1913, the country saw the creation of the Federal Reserve and the income tax creation. It was born in that same year, and also was the passage of the 17th Amendment in 1913. Now, some see the 17th Amendment as the uprooting of the balance of power between the states and the federal government, with the states yielding too much power to Washington, while others see a strengthening of democracy and the democratic power to the people by choosing their own state senators directly with their own personal vote. That's where we are. 17th Amendment, to repeal or not to repeal, and so let's let the debate begin. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, John. All right, we're going to jump right in. We have two panels. The first is the historic purposes of the 17th Amendment, what the framers were trying to achieve and whether it worked out as expected. And the second is whether or not to repeal, and then the conversation with George Will. For our first panel, please join me in welcoming three distinguished guests. Richard Duncan is Sherman Welton Professor of Law and Warren Weiss Professor of Law at Nebraska College of Law. David Gans is Director of the Human Rights, Civil Rights, and Citizenship Program at the Constitutional Accountability Center. And Wendy Schiller is Professor of Political Science, Professor of International and Public Affairs, and Chair of Political Science at Brown. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Wonderful. Perfect. Let us begin, fellow congregants, with the text. And you can download it on the interactive Constitution, which you all know about it, and I have it right here. And the beginning of the text of the 17th Amendment, which I need my constitutional reading glasses to read, is, "The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years." That was not what the framers of the Constitution anticipated. Madison said in Federalist 55, "In all large assemblies of whatever character compose, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob." So Athens was determined to promote reason rather than passion and created the Senate as an aristocratic body to be cool and deliberate and to stay popular passions, especially from the people, so that reason could prevail. And his mechanism for doing that was the indirect election of senators who were originally chosen by state legislatures rather than directly by the people. So the first question we need to establish is a historical one, and that is why precisely did the framers choose the indirect election of senators? What were they trying to achieve? We'll do that, and then we'll ask how it worked out, but I want to begin with you, Richard. Why did Madison choose to have indirect election of senators?
Yeah, I think there were 2 reasons. One reason is that a senator will be faithful to whoever appoints him or elects him. And so I think one of the ideas was that if the senators were selected by the state legislature, then the United States senators would owe their loyalty to the state legislatures and would be more faithful to the interests of the state. I think that was one reason, and I think a second reason was the reason that we just discussed, and that is the idea that the Senate would be kind of like a House of Lords, a place where a better quality, more like Warren Buffett than Jimmy Buffett would serve would serve in the United States Senate. It would represent the wealth of the nation, the corporate interests of the nation, the 1% interests, if you will. So I think those were 2 of the reasons that you asked about.
Wonderful. David, anything to add about what the framers were trying to achieve?
I mean, I think you also have to remember the House was set up as sort of the democratic body that would represent the people, and the Senate was representing the states. Each state got 2 senators. I mean, they didn't push it as far as they might have. I think they didn't have states vote as a delegation the way they did at the Constitutional Convention. Each senator got to vote his or her mind. And so, Massachusetts' senators might disagree, even though they're both representing the state.
Great. Wendy, you can add to the original understanding if you like, but you're the author of the definitive study about how it actually worked out in practice. And you've done a study of vote roll call records by senators between in the 19th century, up before the adoption of the 17th Amendment. And you found that while U.S. Senate elections in the indirect age were more conflicted than previously believed, there are strong parallels to today's Senate in terms of the types of candidates that ran for Senate, the role of money in elections, and the role of partisan elections, and the nature of senator ideological and legislative behavior. So tell us about how the actual performance of senators worked out in contrast to Madison's expectations.
Well, Madison, there's a wonderful book by Percival Squire on colonial assemblies. And colonial assemblies were quite well organized and quite firmly structured. They were impressive. People served, they served more than one term. They really took it seriously in the colonial assembly. But when we transitioned, obviously, in our own independence, you start the first sort of 70 years, and all the Constitution says is state legislature shall select senators. Nothing about how to do it, just to do it. So they all come up with different ways of doing it when they felt like it. There wasn't even a uniform time sometimes that they selected their senators. By the mid-1860s, believe it or not, after the Civil War, just after the Civil War, the process got so complicated, no offense to anybody from New Jersey. Anybody from New Jersey? So you guys are the reason that the Congress adopted in 1866 a uniform standard for electing U.S. senators in state legislatures. So if you're worried about federalism, this is the first time the federal government actually tells states how to run their own elections for U.S. senators. And what happened was on the second Tuesday of when you come back in session, and most state legislatures came back in January, except the southern ones that came back in April and May. And if you've been to the South, like Louisiana, you wonder about the wisdom of that decision in 1870 or 1880. But they would come back, and at noon, they would vote in their respective chambers. That's it. The House would meet, the Senate would meet separately at noon on the second Tuesday. And whoever won a majority of each chamber, not of both, of each chamber, if it was the same person, they would the next day say, this is the senator from our state. And so that was the procedure. But if they did not agree, and they didn't select the same person with the same majority, they would continue to vote in joint session together every day thereafter that they were in session to select a senator. And about 29% of all the elections, there are about 750 elections during this 40-year period we studied, about 30% of them were conflictual, meaning they didn't agree on the first day, and they would literally have to vote together. Imagine the United States Congress, the House and the Senate, getting together in that round middle chamber to meet every day, and that's what they had to do. So the system was messy, it was unorganized. Then the Congress intervenes in a very top-down fashion from the federal government and says to states, this is how you must pick your senators. And what happened over the 40 years also was that 45 times they didn't pick a senator. They simply fought with each other the entire session, and then they went home and said, see you next year. And they just didn't have a senator for that period of time. So I want to really stress that this idea that there were these intact, organized state legislatures that were very much cognizant of state power being represented by senators in the United States Senate during this latter part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century is simply not overly accurate when you go into the state legislative archives and you look at what they did and how they did it. And we'll elaborate a little bit more later. But that was how it was done. And just to be blunt, it was not pretty.
Thank you for that. Richard, you do believe that the 17th Amendment protected federalism and states' rights throughout the 19th century. Tell us how you think it operated in practice, and also how the states, after Congress mandated that uniform law, began to balance these two systems, the caucus system that elected Lincoln and Douglas, and then eventually the Oregon system, where increasingly states themselves began to require a degree of popular involvement.
Yeah, I mean, I think by the time that the 17th Amendment was ratified, a majority of the states were already effectively having popular election of senators. And, you know, my view is that who elects the senators is not as important as the fact that the states get equal suffrage in the Senate. The most important part for federalism to me of the Constitution is the fact that each state gets 2 senators. Wyoming, with less than 600,000 citizens, gets 2 senators, and California, with 34 or 35 million citizens, gets 2 senators. And I think that's what really gives the states equal representation, because of our bicameral system. In order for any type of federal tax or federal regulation or federal law to be enacted, you have to get a majority in the House, but also effectively a majority of the states. You have to get effectively 25 and a half states voting through their United States senators to agree. And the Constitution gives the Senate extraordinary powers. Not only does the Senate obviously get a veto over ordinary legislation, but it also gets a veto through the confirmation process, the advice and consent process, over Supreme Court justices and other federal judges, cabinet officials, and other federal officers. The reason that Justice Gorsuch is a justice right now rather than Merrick Garland being a justice is because Obama lost the Senate, and the Senate decided to basically tide that seat over to the 2016 election. So it's critically important that you have a majority in the Senate if you want to get anything done. Also, treaties have to be confirmed by the Senate, and maybe of some interest to some of you, impeachments are tried in the United States Senate.
On a nonpartisan basis.
And it requires a 2/3 vote to convict, which is, the Clintons also appreciate that 2/3 vote rule. So the Senate has extraordinary powers, and the states have equal representation in the Senate. And to me, that is what makes the Senate a powerful institution for federalism, for protecting the liberty of we the people in the states.
But because you're taking this position on this panel, do you also want to argue that the indirect election of senators in the 19th century was helpful in protecting federalism?
I think probably all things being considered, you're more likely to be loyal to whoever it is sends you to the Senate. So, and the fact that the Senate and the House have different constituencies. The House is elected by the people in districts. Originally, the Senate was chosen by state legislatures, so there was a different constituency. So again, that makes it a little bit more difficult to get a federal law enacted. And under the Supremacy Clause, federal laws trump state laws. And so if you're trying to protect the interests of the state, you want to make it difficult for state laws to be enacted. Justice Scalia once said, if you're upset with deadlock, you don't understand the Constitution. The Constitution was designed to create deadlock. The Constitution was designed to make it hard for the national government to enact laws that tax and regulate us. We should love deadlock because it's a rare day when Congress gets together to vote to increase our liberties or to cut our taxes.
Thank you for that. David, perhaps you can make the case against the indirect election of senators and explain why the 17th Amendment was adopted. As Richard said, almost a majority of states had adopted the Oregon system having direct election before the 17th Amendment. But what happened in the second half of the 19th century?
Sure, I mean, so
we
could sort of ask the question, did the states kill federalism? Because the states were really the drivers behind the 17th Amendment. You can think of, there's some amendments, like the Civil War amendments, where Congress was in the driver's seat pushing it, and the states ultimately ratified. The 17th Amendment was really very state-directed. So we have, a couple different important things. So one, you have a lot of state legislative activity giving people important roles in actually the election of senators. You have, by 1912, 33 states having direct primaries. And those were particularly important in one-party states where the primary might be kind of the whole event. You have a smaller number of states that had adopted what was known as the Oregon Plan, and state legislatures would pledge whether they would agree to abide by the people's choice for Senate. Sort of even more, you have from the 1870s until I think 1912, hundreds of state legislatures petitioning Congress to adopt an amendment giving the people the right to vote for senators. The stumbling block was always the Senate. The Senate liked, I think they liked the ability to, they didn't have to campaign across the state and win a statewide vote. They had to, sort of work the political scene, in the state legislature, and in many cases that was kind of getting their money into the right hands. You sort of saw in this period kind of unbelievable rampant corruption, and ultimately what sort of pushed the process to the 17th Amendment was 27 states had called for a constitutional convention. Only 31 were required. There was kind of this fear of there's going to be a runaway convention that will, change the Constitution, and we're not sure which ways. And then I think then finally the Senate sort of relented, and the amendment was passed. So I think the amendment sort of reflects sort of principles that are pretty deeply rooted in the Constitution, both the founding Constitution and amendments adopted, which is the right to vote. The 17th Amendment sort of, affirms the people should select their senators, not they shouldn't be selected for them. And states were interestingly, were sort of the ones pushing to sort of say, don't put this process on us. And some of that, I think, perhaps is tied into, these deadlocks that, the states were spending all this time on trying to get a senator, as opposed to doing sort of state business. And increasingly, those were the issues that I think were consuming state legislative elections, not sort of what laws should the state have on its own. So I think, one, you see the framers and the states pushing for sort of more democracy, which is, a core constitutional value, and also recognizing that, the founders' design was not working. So in some ways, you have kind of the triumph of laboratories of experimentation leading to a system that I think furthers fundamental constitutional values by giving the people the ultimate say.
Great, so two helpful points. The first is that the 17th Amendment was adopted by Congress essentially at gunpoint. There was a threat that the state legislatures were going to demand a convention of the states if Congress failed to propose it, and therefore Congress preferred to draft it itself rather than resist this populist wave. And then you said it wasn't working as intended, and far from protecting federalism, state legislative elections became about the election of senators, not about any other issues, and because that question was swamping states' rights, federalism was served rather than threatened by the 17th Amendment. Wendy, let's really dig into your definitive study. You examine the role of money in politics during the 19th century and find that senators are dialing for dollars just as much as they are today, and you also say that similar kinds of people were elected with similar amounts of political experience. So give us a sense of the kind of senators who were elected under the pre-17th Amendment system.
So the pre-17th Amendment, the vast majority of men, and almost all men, went to the Senate from the position of the House of Representatives or governor or attorney general. Sometimes judge was elected, sometimes a private, wealthy business person. But the distribution of the prior experience of senators in that period of time, from 1871 to 1913, looks very similar to today. So about 44% of all senators came directly from the House of Representatives in those days. Today, about 53% of senators come from the House of Representatives. About the same proportion of governors today and then. A classic example in 1899 of money, and I want to stress that about 67% of state legislators only served 2 years. They were there and they were gone. So they weren't there 6 years later to re-examine the behavior of these senators who were coming back to seek re-election. And we know that 61% of all the senators during that period of time sought re-election, and then 70% of them were re-elected. So we have about an 86 or 87% re-election rate today. The amendment itself and the sort of selling point the progressives made about the amendment was that it would clean up politics, make the Senate more responsive to the average person, and change who was getting elected to the Senate. You can argue in some ways some things have changed. Certainly women get elected to the Senate now. But generally speaking, it didn't really change all that much. And the reason is what drove all those dynamics were short-term interests and parties, and fights between factions in parties. And Philadelphia is a fantastic setting for this. One of the most famous of these elections is Matthew Quay in 1899, a huge deadlock. The legislature votes and votes and votes because a guy named Wanamaker was pushing to get rid of Quay. And so these can be Democrat, Republican, or Republican-only fights. The Republican Party had a real dilemma at the turn of the century because they were being eaten alive by the populists on one hand, the Farmers Alliance, and the progressives were just blowing up the Republican Party. So it made these elections very unpredictable. So going to the 17th Amendment direct election kind of made things a little more predictable for them because they weren't dealing with all these micro factions anymore. They could wage a popular, open campaign. So to think of state legislatures as organized and cohesive and get-along parties, the only one that looks like that is Kansas, although they were plagued with horrible corruption. But they actually had a pretty smooth sail. But generally, it was chaotic, and generally it was chaotic driven by growing differences in the way that parties sought votes and the way that party machines tried to handle or try to control the distribution of state resources. And as states grew with the Industrial Revolution, there was more to go around to fight over. So that was the sort of scenario that people said, hey, maybe we should think about doing this in a different way.
Okay, very important. So, Richard, you are making the pro-federalism case, and so far we've heard from Wendy and David that things weren't that different before and after the 17th Amendment. The money played a big role in politics, the same kind of people were elected. How do you think that the direct election of senators changed the nature of senators who were chosen? Were they more responsive to popular whims and passions, and did a different character of Madisonian nightmare emerge, or not?
Well, again, I am making the federalism case, but I don't think that the 17th Amendment wasn't the day the music died for federalism. I think the key to federalism is the equal representation of the states. Madison called the people the supreme authority in the state. And all that happened when the 17th Amendment was enacted is that the power to elect senators went from a secondary authority in the state, the people's representatives in the state legislatures, to the supreme authority in the state, the people themselves. So for me, the key to federalism, and what's left of federalism, and federalism has diminished. But I think the reason it's diminished is not so much because of the 17th Amendment. It's because of an expansive interpretation of the commerce power of Congress. It's because of an expansive interpretation of the taxing and spending power of Congress. And yes, it's because of the 16th Amendment, the income tax amendment, that gave Congress the ability to raise so much money and become so powerful. So I think a lot of the loss that we've seen in federalism over the years is not as a result of the 17th Amendment. I think it's a result of other developments. And so if we're going to amend the Constitution to expand federalism, or to at least further protect federalism, I think we need to start thinking about things like a balanced budget amendment, maybe something that would limit the power of taxation, maybe something at least at the margins. We don't live in the same world as the founders. This is not the 18th century. The economy is global today, so we can't have as small a government we had in 1789. But I think we can, at least at the margins, restrict some of the powers of Congress under the Commerce Clause. We can rein that back in. And if we do those things, we'd see a lot more federalism. And again, as long as the states have equal suffrage in the Senate, something that was so important to the founders, that Article 5 of the Constitution, the amendment provision of the Constitution, says that no state can be deprived of its equal vote in the Senate without its consent. So not even a constitutional amendment can take away the equal representation, say, of Wyoming in the Senate, because the founders, I think, thought that it was the equal suffrage is what gave the states an equal voice in one house of the United States Congress.
Powerful arguments for resurrecting federalism by another means, but we still do need to moot this question of whether repeal of the 17th Amendment would help. And our next panelist, you're going to hear some strong arguments that it would. So I do want to drill down on this question of how senators are different post-17th Amendment than before. David, how did the 17th Amendment change the election of senators? How did the role of money change? And let me also put on the table, how did the role of the parties change? Did the parties want the 17th Amendment, and has their decline post-17th Amendment been because of that amendment or for other factors?
In terms of money, I think it's certainly true that there was a lot of money in elections before and after, but it was quite different. You look at sort of the story of the 17th Amendment, and you have sort of, just shocking bribery being used to control these elections. Here's kind of a stunning fact. In the 58th Congress, which was 1903 to 1905, 10% of the Senate was either being tried or under investigation. perhaps afterwards you have people spending a lot of money, and of course, it takes a lot of money to run a statewide campaign, even more, in a larger, very populous state. But so there's more money being kind of put into running elections, kind of bringing issues to the people. I think you saw a lot of, just out and out bribery, sort of the purest kind of corruption. And, I think the 17th Amendment, maybe it redirected the money and said, elections should be about electoral activities and debate on the issues. It shouldn't be about sort of using wealth to sort of undermine the democratic process and make backroom deals. And so the sort of, in some ways, we had this lofty idea of federalism and what it would mean to have state legislatures selecting them, but in practice it was, a somewhat faulty federalism in which, money was putting in place, candidates who got there through sort of fraudulent and corrupt means. In terms of the parties, I mentioned kind of the outpouring of state legislatures petitioning Congress. There were huge numbers of party platforms that were devoted to this issue. I'm not sure how it broke down kind of among the various parties, but this was an issue that I think was being pushed very aggressively. I think even among people who might disagree on other issues, and once it cleared the Senate, in less than a year it became part of the Constitution. It was overwhelmingly ratified by the states. So we started out with this idea of a republic, and the founders chose, the basic idea of a republic, I go back to sort of something Hamilton said in the New York Ratifying Convention, which is, sort of the true theory of a republic is the right of the people to choose who will govern them. And we said we're going to have a different rule for the House and the Senate, and I think the sweep of history suggested that was a flawed system, and it would be better to have the people decide who their representatives would be and who would make federal laws that would govern them.
Thank you for that. Wendy, one more beat on the history and then how the 17th Amendment changed things. This was a bipartisan reform, I think. My great hero, President William Howard Taft, came reluctantly to support the 17th Amendment, although he was no populist, I think because he recognized which way the wind was blowing. So is it right that both the Democratic and Republican national parties came to support the 17th Amendment? And then tell us, how did the 17th Amendment change the nature of senators? And even though you say there are similarities in the kind of people who are appointed, tell us about the differences.
So if you look at what senators did between the 1870s and 1913, we know the federal government was relatively small, very small. The budget was less than $300 million at the federal level. Today's budget is $4.4 trillion, give or take a few $100 million. So you think about that, what did they do? Well, they actually did things. They introduced bills. They introduced bills on behalf of, let's say, Civil War pension recipients. The Northern senators did that. And then the Southerners would introduce called relief bills to get people loans or to get them recognized by the government, or there were small programs available then. They introduced bills on, as soon as you get into the 1880s, 1890s, on antitrust, for example. They started to do things. There were 76 committees in the Senate. They introduced hundreds and hundreds of bills. They actually did things. And why did they do things? You think, well, why? There wasn't that much to do. They needed to hedge their bets, senators, because even though there were state nominating conventions, these factions made it very uncertain when they went up for re-election which faction was going to support them. Now, they could get money and they could distribute money, but if you deadlocked, the next day the legislature would say, give me more money. I voted for you yesterday, but I'm not going to vote for you today. You have to pay me again. Uncertainty was the senator's enemy. So in order to build support in the party structure, you would do things. You would give speeches, you would introduce bills. In 1900, Furnifold Simmons from North Carolina campaigned on getting $200,000 or $300,000 in the Rivers and Harbors bill to build a bridge. The same things you hear today. So they were engaging in legislation, but the size of the federal government was so much smaller. It wasn't as much policy as it was constituency service. So they still do those things today, even though the Congress has cut back down on those specialized projects. And they were attentive to party leaders and rich people. Party leaders and rich people. That should sound familiar to you. The problem for them was that state legislators turned over so much. So they literally were not going back to the same constituency in the state legislature that they had when they got elected. And to me, that's the most important feature of the reform of the 17th Amendment. Most people don't leave the state. So when you get elected at time T and you're up again in 2018, you're going back to a majority of people who still live there, who remembered voting for or against you. It gives you some certainty as a senator on how to craft a reputation and represent your state. A little more stability, a little more longevity. In those days, you had no idea who was going to be in the state legislature. You had an idea of the party control, but that started to change as well. So that's, I think, the big thing, is that the sort of crafting a career as a senator got actually easier with the 17th Amendment because you knew who your voters would be every time you went back to get reelected. And that, I think, bodes potentially well for representation. In other words, there was an ability for voters to form a more direct relationship with this person who was likely to seek office over and over again because of the stability of the population of the state rather than the instability of the population of the state legislature.
Great. All right, one more round and then we'll have our second panel about whether or not to repeal. Richard, Wendy just said that the 17th Amendment made the senators more directly representative to the people. They knew who they were representing. But that was a Madisonian nightmare. He didn't want them to be representative to the people. He wanted to cool the passions. Right. So if you had to pick a single reform that would cool passions and insulate senators from the passions of their constituents today in this land of Twitter and Facebook and all these populist pressures, what would it be?
Well, I guess the question begs the answer in that sense. If I wanted to cool passions and
well, say you'd want
right,
to.
Yeah.
What would Madison wanted to? So whether you want to or not, what would it be?
I understand. And you know, if I wanted to get this type of person who was more of the wealth. Madison wanted senators to represent the wealth class, the corporate class. So if I wanted the Warren Buffetts of the world, something I don't want, but if I wanted the Warren Buffetts of the world to be chosen for the United States Senate, I suppose something, either the state legislature, probably be better if the governor did the selection, then the governor speaks with one voice, would choose senators to represent the states, and then you might get a Colin Powell being convinced to go into the United States Senate rather than have to run for office. You might get a Warren Buffett to serve one term. I think some people think, and I'm not sure about the statistics on this, but I think some people think that before the 17th Amendment, terms in the Senate tended to be shorter. People would go in and out of the Senate. They might go into the executive branch and serve as a cabinet official for a while, go back to the Senate, maybe go back to their business, go back to the military. And so I think that may be the case, that direct election of senators might have led to a sort of a professional class of politicians, a professional class of senators who serve for 40, 50 years in the Senate.
Thank you for that. David, as Richard said, some founders, especially Hamilton, wanted a sort of aristocratic financial elite. Madison maybe is more concerned about the reasoned class. He called it the literati, who are going to represent reason rather than passion, rather than favoring one economic class over another. But are you concerned that I won't ask whether you're concerned. If you had to come up with a single reform to promote reason rather than passion in the Senate? Since you don't think the repeal of the 17th Amendment would do it, what would you do?
I mean, so one, before we get to that, I mean, so even when we started and described kind of some of the ideas behind, they seemed so fundamentally in tension with kind of this idea of sort of we the people, of, you look at the very first sentence of the Federalist Papers, and Hamilton says, you are called on to choose, a constitution for the United States, which is, again, like, remember, democracy is nowhere in sight the rest of the world. This is kind of a very stark vision of popular sovereignty, of popular self-governance, and sort of this idea like, well, actually, this vision of the Senate is really sort of in tension with that, in very serious tension, and I think sort of working through of our history sort of has exposed that tension, and I think we've sort of correctly resolved that in line with kind of this sort of founding principle that I identified with Hamilton, about the true sort of principle of the republic is the people governing themselves. I mean, I think, in many ways, some of the worries that you raise are attributable to something the founders were not familiar with, which is the parties. I mean, some of what drives who's showing up to Congress is driven by primaries, and I think we've seen kind of primary systems where, that have sort of pushed the parties to select people who maybe satisfy the party faithful, but see things in a very polarizing way. I mean, there, of course, daily reports of sort of Congress is totally polarized. I think there are many who sort of long for an age of, of compromise that seems, so some of it is, there's kind of a whole system that came after the founding, the rise of the party system, which has all sorts of effects on the selection of legislative leaders.
Yes, as you said, the founders did not anticipate the rise of parties, and we are experiencing today a polarization between red and blue America that seems at odds with the Madisonian ideal of cooled, reasoned, slow deliberation over time. Wendy, the final and same question to you. A single reform that would promote that cool, reasoned deliberation.
Well, Jefferson, let's just bring him in since, I'm talking about Jefferson said the people shall always be their best army. They may go astray, but they will soon correct themselves, meaning they'll have a midterm election and then another election. I don't mean that about Trump. I mean just generally about the fact that we have a lot of constitutionally scheduled elections on purpose. But I would say that I always think that reform and getting better government will have to come from the demand of people who vote for better government. And so I'd like to, I've learned doing the book on the 17th Amendment that you promise things will get better if you change the rules of the game, but things didn't change as much as people might have hoped when we changed the rules of the game, at least with the 17th Amendment. So I would say two things. One is, my first book was on senators from the same state and how they represent their states as delegations. Even though they're elected at different times and they have individual votes in the Senate, senators are a pair from a state. And you used to have the glory days, you used to have in Pennsylvania alone, you'd have split delegations. And more split delegations. We only have 13 states now, I believe, that have a Republican and a Democratic senator. If you had more split delegations, you would get more moderation, you would get more compromise, you would get more reason, and you would get better representation for whole states rather than just the party of the people that have elected senators from the same party from the same state. So I would urge you to think about that when you make your choices, and I think that would help a great deal. And the second thing I will say, based on research on some of my female colleagues in political science, and some male colleagues as well, that if you elect more women to the Senate, you will get a more reasoned and deliberate mind.
Wonderful suggestion of which Madison would be proud. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our first panel.
That was good. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Jeff.
Super nerd. Wonderful.